to Discover You Radio's discussion. Stay tuned for Dakota Freeman and Lauren Miller as they get into an intense debate regarding the subject matter as they give two separate opinions helping to build this legendary legacy.
Welcome to the debate. Imagine for a second discovering that the foundational word of your lifelong faith was, well, pronounced incorrectly.
Oh, wow. Yeah.
And that fixing it, requires you to basically tear down your entire life. You're forced into this really terrifying position.
Right? Do you ignore the revelation and just, stay within that comfortable inherited community?
Exactly. Or do you follow this new truth, even if it means walking away from literally everything you know?
It's a premise that, honestly, it immediately raises the hairs on the back of the neck for, anyone who relies on historical tradition.
Sure, it's radical.
It is. Because discarding a theological map that's been compiled by generations of scholars just because you experienced a momentary, highly personal disorientation, that isn't just an act of bravery. I mean, it borders on hubris.
You think it's hubris?
I do. You might find a new path, sure, but you are just as likely to walk yourself right off a philosophical cliff.
Well, that exact tension between inherited certainty and individual discovery is what we are dissecting today. We're examining the story and the music of Lonnie Carter.
Right, the artist known as Yahua Praise.
Yes, exactly. Yahua Praise. And in his song, My Testimony, Carter chronicles this profound spiritual rupture. He basically describes living his entire life as a dedicated, passionate Christian.
Completely immersed in the doctrine of his parents, yeah.
Right. But then he experiences what he calls a light bulb moment. He hears a very specific name, Yahua, and his entire theological framework just collapses and then rebuilds itself.
Which really brings us to a profound, universally relevant question, especially for those who, approach non-traditional spiritual paths with a healthy dose of skepticism.
Right. It goes way beyond just Carter's theology.
Exactly. We are asking, does leaving traditional religious doctrine for personal revelation fundamentally help or harm one's faith?
Well, I take the position that abandoning an inherited doctrine in favor of personal revelation ultimately helps. It strengthens one's faith because it creates this profound individual empowerment.
Okay, but how so?
Because when we analyze Carter's story, we see this realization that passive acceptance of religion is, it's essentially hollow. True, resilient faith actually requires active, sometimes really painful discovery.
I mean, I hear that, but
it demands that you pull the veil back yourself, rather than just trusting the institution to do it for you.
Right. And I take the position that while personal revelation is undeniably powerful on an emotional level, completely severing ties with established religious institutions frequently harms a person's faith in the long run.
You think it inherently causes harm?
In the long run, yes, because it removes foundational stability. I caution strongly against discarding the historical, collective consensus of scriptural interpretation just based on a singular, highly subjective experience.
Even if the experience feels objectively true to them?
Even then, institutions and traditions exist for a reason, They act as the essential guardrails of belief. Without them, things get dangerous.
Well, to really get to the bottom of this, we need to look at the specific catalyst for Carter. We can't just talk about revelation in the abstract.
Sure. Let's look at the text.
Yeah. In his background submission, Carter explicitly notes that scriptures he read his entire life, they just simply did not make sense to him.
Right.
But once he heard the name Yahoo, he says he finally understood the foundation. So we need to unpack what is actually happening there, technically and theologically.
Right, because without context, the listener might wonder why a simple change in pronunciation triggers a total religious deconstruction.
Exactly. It sounds like a small thing.
It does, but we are talking about a shift toward what is broadly known as the Hebrew roots or sacred name movement. Historically, in most English translations of the Bible, the sacred Hebrew name of God, the Tetragrammaton, YWH, was substituted with the title, the Lord.
Right, which is a massive translation choice.
It is. and Carter is adopting the phonetic transliteration Yahua. And for him, recovering this original pronunciation isn't just like a linguistic correction.
No, it's a total rejection.
Exactly. It represents a rejection of centuries of Western institutional church tradition, which he believes obscured the truth.
And I argue that this shift provides superior scriptural clarity. I mean, traditional doctrine often acts as a fog.
A fog.
Yeah, a fog. It's this thick layer of interpretation forced over the text by centuries of institutional politics and translation compromises. When Carter strips all that away and finds this original name, Yahuwah, it acts as a cipher.
Okay, a cipher.
Yes, a cipher that unlocks the unvarnished meaning of the text. His faith is helped because he's no longer engaging with the translation of an idea. He believes he has the key to the original source code.
I understand the appeal of that narrative. I really do. But if we look at the psychological mechanics of what you are calling a cipher, I see something entirely different.
Which is what?
I see the ultimate confirmation bias lens. When someone adopts a radically new singular key in this case, focusing entirely on the specific revelation of the name Yahoo, they don't necessarily unlock objective truth.
Well, wait. You don't think it's possible that the new filter is simply more accurate than the old one?
It might feel that way to the individual, sure, but the text suddenly makes sense, not because the fog has listed, but because the believer is now selectively ignoring any nuance that doesn't fit their new paradigm.
I disagree. He's not ignoring nuance. He's finding clarity.
But it is incredibly common in spiritual awakenings to mistake a novel interpretation for superior clarity. The psychological relief of ending cognitive dissonance, it feels identical to discovering the truth.
Yeah, but
Often, it's just the comfort of a simplified narrative, you know? You aren't actually seeing the landscape more clearly, you're just looking at it through a much narrower tube.
I see why you might categorize it as a narrow tube. But, I mean, that assumes the previous institutional lens wasn't also a narrow tube. Fair point. One that was built to sustain the institution rather than enlighten the individual, right? Carter's lyrics explicitly state, I was blind and could not see. I thought I was right. Truth wasn't in me.
Right, he acknowledges his past bias.
Lee gave him all the answers without any effort. The fundamental difference is that his new understanding requires him to actively work.
Because he has to study it himself now.
Yes, as he sings, he had to study to show myself approved. He's doing the rigorous intellectual labor that the church previously just, did for him.
That is a fair point regarding his personal effort, but doing the labor with a predetermined conclusion that this specific name is the sole foundational truth that invalidates literally everything else, that's just building a new institution of one.
An institution of one?
Yeah. You are substituting the historical consensus of millions of scholars for the subjective epiphany of a single mind.
But that singular epiphany inherently changes how you interact with the world around you. Let's follow the logical consequence of this shift.
Okay, let's look at the consequences.
Changing how you read the sacred text inherently alienates you from the people who taught you that text. A theological shift this dramatic, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. It completely alters the believer's social ecosystem.
It really does.
So we have to look at whether breaking away from these religious institutions creates social isolation or if it leads to individual empowerment.
And this right here is where I see the most profound harm in this process. If we look closely at the lyrics of My Testimony, Carter sings, "People talked and people judged."
Yeah, it's a painful lyric.
And he describes how everything I knew came crashing down. That isn't just poetic language, that is the very real collateral damage of discarding your heritage. Leaving the tradition your parents handed down inherently isolates you from your physical, historical community.
Isolation implies he is left with nothing, though. He is actively choosing to step away.
But look at what he is stepping away from. Religion is not just a set of abstract intellectual ideas. It is a vital, physical, social safety net.
Sure, it provides community.
It's the community that brings casseroles to your house when you're sick, right? That watches your children, that provides a shared physical space for grief and celebration. That physical community provides what I would call embodied spiritual friction.
Embodied spiritual friction. I like that phrase.
Yeah, you have to sit in the pew next to people who annoy you, people you disagree with, and figure out how to love them anyway. By trading that institutional stability for a personal revelation about the name Yahoo, the individual is often left adrift.
Adrift is a strong word, but that isolation makes faith incredibly difficult to sustain during periods of ordinary human hardship, because the physical support system has literally been burned away by the pursuit of subjective truth.
I concede that losing a physical safety net is terrifying and, it requires a massive sacrifice. But let me offer a different perspective on what actually replaces it.
Okay, what replaces it?
Because the evidence shows Carter is anything but adrift. If we look at his digital footprint, specifically his TikTok platform, under the handle @yah.motivation, we see a completely different sociological reality.
On TikTok. Yes, on TikTok, he has amassed 11.6 thousand followers. His videos, some of them reaching over 9,000 views, they are explicitly framed as encouragement for the people of Yahua.
Right, but you're comparing a digital audience to a physical congregation.
I am comparing an inherited community to an intentional one. This is the ultimate form of individual empowerment.
Is it though?
Absolutely. He traded a geographical community where he felt blind and passive for a chosen network of active seekers. He's no longer just sitting in a pew, passively receiving doctrine. He is leading, motivating, and connecting with a global network.
I hear you, but
This modern framework allows faith to thrive through active engagement. He built a new ecosystem that actually supports his theological convictions rather than suppressing them.
I understand the modern appeal of that. I really do. But an algorithmically driven platform of 11.6 thousand people tapping a screen, that does not replace the friction and accountability of a real-world congregation.
Why not? They share his beliefs.
Because what Carter has found online isn't necessarily a community. It is parasocial theological validation.
Parasocial theological validation? Come on, explain how that diminishes the reality of his faith.
Because it is inherently frictionless. It is incredibly easy to feel empowered and validated when you are broadcasting to an audience that has been curated by an algorithm to already agree with your highly specific revelation.
So they agree with him? That makes it invalid?
If you say something they don't like, they just scroll past. There is zero accountability. True resilient faith is forged in the fires of dealing with people in your actual physical life. When you trade embodied spiritual friction for parasocial validation, you might feel more empowered, but your faith is actually untested by reality.
Well, I push back strongly on the idea that his faith is untested by reality, because this digital community is built around a very strict physical reality.
A physical reality? How so?
If he is trading his inherited peers for digital followers, we have to look at what exactly he is practicing in his daily life now. And this brings us to the validity of the legacy he left behind and the concept of orthopraxy.
Orthopraxy, meaning right action, as opposed to orthodoxy, which is right belief.
Exactly. Carter's rejection of his past actually proves the robustness of his new faith because it is profoundly grounded in orthopraxy. In his lyrics, he doesn't just say his past was slightly misguided.
Right. He's pretty harsh about it.
He says it was built on a lie my parents dealt, and notes he was previously just minding my business eating unclean food. He isn't just chasing an emotional high or looking for digital likes.
You're saying it requires action.
His revelation regarding the name Yahoo demands rigorous, disciplined action. He specifies that he had to know Torah and he completely changed his lifestyle and his diet.
And you view that added restriction as a benefit?
Absolutely. I view it as the mechanism of how faith becomes real. When personal revelation leads to a stricter orthopraxy, a dedication to disciplined living and dietary laws, it wires the belief right into the nervous system.
Wow. Into the nervous system.
It moves faith from an intellectual concept in the brain to a physical reality in the body. Choosing what you can and cannot eat multiple times a day is a constant physical reminder of your devotion.
I see that.
It demonstrates that abandoning the inherited doctrine wasn't an escape from rules or like an attempt to make life easier. It was a willful submission to a higher, more demanding truth. His faith is profoundly helped because it transitions from passive inheritance to active obedience.
Okay, that is a fascinating way to frame orthopraxy, and I acknowledge that changing your daily physical habits requires immense dedication. But I just don't buy that this indicates long-term stability. Let me explain the epistemological trap Carter is walking into here.
All right, I'm listening.
There is immense danger in labeling a lifelong, passionate Christian foundation, one that sustained his family, his early life, and generations before him, as completely useless and truthless, as the song claims.
But if he believes it's a lie, he has to say so.
But think about the precedent this sets. If a faith built over decades, supported by centuries of institutional tradition, can be entirely overturned by a single light bulb moment, by hearing one specific pronunciation of Yahua, doesn't that make this new faith incredibly fragile?
Fragile how? He is studying Torah and living it every single day.
It is fragile because of how it was built. You are essentially building a house on a fault line. By establishing the precedent that all previous historical and institutional knowledge can be wiped out by one subjective revelation, you legitimize the complete destruction of your own foundation.
I think you're overstating the risk.
What happens when the next revelation comes along? What happens when he has a bad day, or reads a convincing article, or has another light bulb moment that contradicts his current beliefs?
Then he adapts.
But if the foundation of your belief is the validity of your own sudden paradigm shifts, then your faith is always just one new realization away from completely collapsing again. It creates this cycle of endless deconstruction.
That is a compelling argument regarding the fear of endless deconstruction. But have you considered that the willingness to let the house collapse is the very definition of seeking truth?
Seeking truth shouldn't mean constantly destroying your shelter.
If you are afraid to let a false foundation crumble just because you fear the instability of the earthquake, you're choosing comfort over authenticity. We cannot let the fear of what happens next prevent us from acting on the truth we see right now.
I am not advocating for comfort, and I am certainly not advocating for staying in a system you believe is false just because it's easy.
Then what are you advocating for?
I am advocating for the humility to recognize that our individual light bulb moments are entirely subjective and historically deeply fallible. The institutions we are so quick to tear down as fogs and lies were built by millions of people who also thought they were seeking the truth.
But if they miss the actual name...
Discarding all of that because of a phonetic transliteration of Yahua removes the very anchors that prevent us from drifting into total ideological isolation.
Well, let's step back and view the entirety of Carter's journey. We have explored the intellectual cipher versus the confirmation bias lens, the intentional digital community versus the inherited physical safety net.
Right. And the physical reality of orthopraxy versus the epistemological trap of sudden revelation.
Exactly. So looking at Lonnie Carter's transformation into a Yahoo of praise, I think it's time to summarize our positions.
I will start. My final position is that while Carter's passion and sincerity are undeniably evident in his music and his lifestyle changes, the template of his journey remains deeply perilous.
Perilous?
Yes. Completely abandoning religious frameworks for a personal revelation strips believers of essential institutional anchors. We must be incredibly careful about discarding the accumulated wisdom, the historical consensus, and that embodied spiritual friction that physical communities provide.
Even if it's based on a powerful reframing?
Especially then. Simply because we experience a powerful moment of cognitive reframing doesn't mean we throw it all the way. A faith that defines itself entirely by a sudden rupture with the past, relying on the intense energy of a new orthopraxy and parasocial validation, it risks leaving the believer deeply vulnerable when the emotional high inevitably fades. The map inherited from our parents might be flawed, but throwing it away entirely usually leaves you lost in the woods.
And my final position remains that leaving traditional doctrine for personal revelation fundamentally helps and empowers faith. Carter's story is a testament to the fact that inherited religion is, essentially, borrowed religion.
Borrowed religion.
Yeah, you are operating on your parents' spiritual capital. It isn't yours. The moment he heard the name Yahua, he stopped being a passive consumer of theology.
He certainly became active, I'll give you that.
You see it as awakened. He rewired his daily physical habits through dietary changes. He faced the judgment of his peers, and he built an intentional community of thousands who share his specific devotion. That is not the portrait of a weakened, fragile faith.
You see it as awakened.
Yes, that is the portrait of a vibrant, awakened, and deeply engaged spiritual life. The friction of leaving the institution, the pain of that rupture, is exactly what sharpened his belief into something genuinely his own.
You know, I think where we fundamentally converge, setting the direct opposition aside, is on the absolute necessity of personal truth.
I agree.
Regardless of whether a person ultimately decides to stay within the historical tradition they were handed, or they choose to walk out the doors of that institution forever, Carter's narrative makes one thing incredibly clear.
Which is?
An unexamined faith is insufficient.
Completely agreed. The most dangerous place for any believer to be is in a state of passive acceptance. The pursuit of spiritual authenticity, the rigorous, sometimes brutal process of asking why you believe what you believe and how you arrived there is universally necessary.
Right.
Even if you end up staying in your childhood faith, you must own it. You have to investigate the walls of your own house.
Precisely.
Carter's journey, whether one agrees with his specific theological conclusions regarding the sacred name of Yahua or not, is a masterclass in refusing to settle for a second-hand belief system.
He refused to settle.
He felt a dissonance, and rather than suppressing it for the sake of social comfort, he pulled the thread.
He forced himself to answer the question rather than just repeating the answer he was given.
He moved from simply knowing what he believed to understanding the mechanics of why he believed it.
Yeah.
Indeed. That is a standard of intellectual and spiritual honesty we can all be held to.
Indeed. The courage to interrogate your own foundation is something to be respected, even by those of us who deeply worry about the structural integrity of what gets built in its place.
Well, there is, of course, so much more to explore in the nuances of spiritual awakenings, the sociology of belief, and the ways we construct meaning in our daily lives through action and community.
There really is. We invite you to reflect on your own spiritual, intellectual, or philosophical foundations.
Ask yourself what you have merely inherited and what you have actually earned through the friction of your own experience.
Because ultimately, you are the one responsible for your own navigation.
Exactly. When the street signs of your life no longer match the doctrine you were given, you have to decide. Do you walk blindly down a path that no longer makes sense to you, or do you pick up the pen and begin the arduous work of drawing your own truth?
Thank you for listening to Discover You Radio's discussions. We'd like to invite you to research the artist who was spotlighted on this episode and add them to your playlist. If they have a website, join their mailing list. You never know. They just may become the next legendary legacy through Discover You Radio. Because listeners like you made it possible. Thank you for your support.